Imagine waking up in the most powerful empire on Earth, only to realize you no longer own your body. You aren't a prisoner of war. You aren't a criminal. You're a Roman citizen, a farmer, a veteran who bled for the legions. But this morning, a man you've never met is standing on your doorstep with a ledger. He tells you that because of a tax you couldn't pay and an interest rate you couldn't track, your land now belongs to the state, and your body now belongs to him. This was the Nexum, the moment the Roman dream became a literal nightmare. Most people think Rome fell because of barbarian swords or lead pipes. They're wrong. Rome fell because it turned its own middle class into a harvest for the elite. It created a system of tax farming so brutal that citizens eventually welcomed the barbarians as liberators. Today, we're going to look at the terrifying blueprint of the first death slaves. And by the end, you'll realize that the fall of Rome wasn't a single event. It was a slow, calculated bankruptcy of the human soul. To understand how it began, in the early Republic, Rome was a city of mud and iron. The heartbeat of the city was the small farmer. These were citizen soldiers who worked the land in spring and carried the sword in summer. But there was a mathematical trap hidden in this lifestyle. When Rome went to war, the farmer had to leave his fields. While he was winning glory, his crops were dying, and his family was starving. To survive, he needed seed and tools, so he went to the wealthy elite. They didn't give charity, they gave Nexum. In the Forum, a ritual took place called per esse et librum, by copper and scales. It was a religious ceremony that bound your soul to a debt. A man held a bronze scale, and the farmer would strike it with copper, swearing that if he failed to pay, his body would belong to the creditor. Once you entered this contract, you weren't slave yet, but you were in debt bondage. Early Roman law was terrifying. If you didn't pay in 30 days, the creditor could bind you in 15 pounds of shackles. If no one bought your debt after 60 days, the law literally allowed creditors to cut your body into pieces to divide the value. By 494 BC, Rome reached a breaking point. Veterans returned from war to find their farms burned and their families in chains. One day, a former centurion rushed into the Forum in rags, covered in whip marks from his owner. This sparked the Great Walkout. The working class simply left the city and sat on a hill. They told the elite, farm the food yourselves, fight the wars yourselves. This forced the creation of laws that abolished the Nexum. It felt like a victory, but the elite simply moved from physical chains to systemic ones. They invented tax farming. As Rome conquered the Mediterranean, the Senate outsourced tax collection to the publicani, the billionaires of the ancient world. The Senate held auctions for the right to tax a province. The publicani would pay the Senate millions up front, and then go into the provinces to squeeze the people for a profit. They brought private armies. If a farmer couldn't pay the tax in silver, the publicani would offer a loan at 50% interest. You were taxed to pay the loan you took out to pay your taxes. Within years, the publicani would seize the land, turning free provinces into massive slave estates. The wealth from tax farming destroyed the Roman middle class. The rich used their profits to buy up all the land in Italy, replacing free farmers with cheap slave labor from the wars. The free citizen simply could not compete. Bankrupt and homeless, hundreds of thousands of Romans moved to the city. To prevent a revolution, the state created bread and circuses, free grain and entertainment. But to pay for that, the state had to tax the provinces even harder, creating a Ponzi scheme of exploitation. The Gracchi brothers tried to fix the system through land reform, but the Senate murdered them both. This proved the system would not change. The Roman people stopped looking to the law and started looking to generals. These generals promised land to the poor in exchange for loyalty. The Roman army was no longer a national force, it was a private debt collection agency. Leaders like Sulla even used lists of wealthy people who could be killed just so the state could seize their assets to pay the troops. The rule of law was dead. The rule of the ledger had begun. By the time Julius Caesar arrived, Rome was drowning in debt. Caesar himself was a massive debtor. When he became dictator, he didn't cancel all debt, but he wiped out about 25% of it. His real solution was conquest. He invaded Gaul to steal enough gold and slaves to keep the economy afloat. This was a temporary fix, a stimulus package funded by blood, but the underlying rot remained. Under the emperors, taxes became invisible. Augustus introduced inheritance taxes and sales taxes. Every time a citizen bought a slave or buried a loved one, the state took a cut. A massive bureaucracy grew. The middle class, the shopkeepers and traders, felt the constant drag of an empire that needed to pay 300,000 soldiers. Rome was a city of marble built on a foundation of crushing interest rates. We see the ultimate end of this in the story of Gaius Verus, a governor who bankrupted Sicily. He invented taxes and forced,
but you cannot legislate value. Sellers simply hid their goods and the markets went empty. Diocletian's solution was to turn the entire population into a permanent tax-producing machine. He ordered a massive census to track every person and created a tax system so complex it accounted for the productivity of every single acre of land. To ensure the taxes were paid, the state passed a law that would change history. The farmers were legally forbidden from leaving their land. You weren't a slave in the traditional sense, but you couldn't move, you couldn't change jobs, and your children were forced to inherit your debt. This was the birth of the medieval serf. The free Roman citizen had been transformed into a state-owned asset. The tax burden was so high that many farmers actually begged wealthy landlords to take their land just to get protection from the government's tax collectors. It wasn't just the farmers. The state extended this hereditary rule to the cities. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. The government needed to know exactly who was in which trade so they could tax them. Even local councilmen were made personally responsible for the tax shortfalls of their towns. Wealthy men began to flee their cities and hide in the woods just to avoid being promoted to the city council. The tax system had become a war of the state against its own people. Writers of the time noted there were more tax collectors than taxpayers. The bureaucracy became so corrupt that you had to bribe the collector just to prevent him from overtaxing you. People lost the will to maintain the empire. Why fight for a government that treats you like a harvest? Why defend a border when the barbarians outside actually lived with more freedom and lower taxes than the civilized Romans inside? When the Visigoths and Vandals finally crossed the borders, they didn't always find resistance. In many provinces, the Roman citizens opened the gates. Historians record that many Romans fled to the barbarian tribes because they preferred poverty with freedom to wealth under the tax collector. The barbarians were often simpler rulers. They wanted loot and land, but they didn't have a 10,000-page tax code or a debased currency. For a Roman farmer who was drowning in debt, the arrival of a Germanic warlord was actually a form of debt forgiveness. The Roman Empire didn't just fall, it was liquidated by its own people. The story of the first debt slaves is a warning about the invisible noose. Rome didn't collapse because it ran out of soldiers. It collapsed because it ran out of citizens. By turning its people into property through debt, taxes, and inflation, the state destroyed the very thing that made Rome powerful, the stake that the average person had in the system. When you see a civilization start to clip its coins, when you see a state that taxes the productive middle to feed a corrupt elite, and when you see the rule of the ledger replace the rule of law, you are looking at the Roman blueprint for collapse. Rome's fall was a 300-year bankruptcy.
If you want to understand how modern financial systems are repeating these ancient patterns, from currency debasement to the squeezing of the middle class, you need to look at the math. And remember, the best way to avoid the fate of the Romans is to understand the game before you're forced to play it. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to know about the hidden family that controls the world from the shadows, check out this video right here. I'll see you soon.